Good morning. I'm delighted to be here with you. If you've never been here, say about an hour before the service, like I was this morning, I recommend that you try to do that sometime. It's a really impressive operation. The amount of work that goes into setting up this space, the children's space. Paul tells me there's over 70 people who are here every Sunday morning getting that together, and I was quite impressed by that. Since we're going to be delving into a bit of science this morning, and that famously can get a little complicated, I thought it good to start from a child's eye perspective on the matter. And who better to get us to the heart of the matter than young Calvin of Calvin and Hobbes fame? Now, if you're young, 20-something, maybe you don't know Calvin and Hobbes, a very famous comic character, but I trust that most of us here are familiar with Calvin. So here's what Calvin and Hobbes, Calvin's little boy walking next to his pet tiger, who comes alive only when Calvin is around alone. And Calvin tells Hobbes, "I've decided to be a fatalist. All events are preordained and unalterable. Whatever will be, will be. That way, if anything bad happens, it's not my fault. It's fate." So then Hobbes trips Calvin. Calvin goes flying. And Hobbes says to Calvin, "Too bad you were fated to do that." And Calvin cries out, "That wasn't fate!" There's actually an important point in this comic, and I'm going to come back to that later. All right, so as we go about our lives, we are constantly confronted with choices. Some choices are immediate. What should we do for lunch today? How should we spend Sunday afternoon? Some involve forming plans. When should I next call my aging father? It's been a while. So should I figure out a time when I should call him in the next couple of weeks? Should I watch less TV? What can we do to better get our household finances into order? And then finally, a few involve big, life-changing matters. There we go. Should I take a job in another city? Is she the one for me? Am I going to embrace the religion of my parents? Or should I commit myself to this new way of life that I've been sort of exploring around the edges? Sometimes these decisions come easily to us, and other times we struggle with them. Either way, we feel that these choices are up to us, that we are in control of how we resolve our own minds, whether we do so wisely or foolishly. This is how it seems to us, at least for those of us who are not in the throes of a deep depression or a powerful addiction or are in some other way mentally afflicted. It's the typical adult human experience. And we think, however little control we may have over the major circumstances that shape our lives, because we control our choices, we are right to hold each other accountable for them, praising others for choosing to do the right thing or blaming them for failing to so choose. This basic understanding of ourselves, common to people everywhere in every culture, is also taught or presupposed in various places in Scripture. So it's hinted at in Genesis 1, where it writes, "So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them." And this text continues, "God blessed them and said to them, 'Be fruitful and increase in number. Fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, and over every living creature that moves on the ground.'" Psalm 8 says, "What is mankind that you are mindful of them? Human beings that you care for them. You have made them a little lower than the angels and crowned them with glory and honor. You made them rulers over the works of your hands. You put everything under their feet." And other texts bring our choosing nature into sharper focus. So again, from the Old Testament, from the book of Deuteronomy, God speaks to his people. "This day I call the heavens and the earth as witnesses against you, that I have set before you life and death, blessings and curses. Now choose life, so that your children may live, and you may love the Lord your God, listen to his voice, and hold fast to him. A final text. As Jesus in the New Testament is about to enter Jerusalem for the last time, he looks out at the city and he cries out, "Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who kill the prophets and stone those sent to you. How often I have longed to gather your children together, as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you were not willing." Now, famously, matters are a little trickier when it comes to the New Testament teaching on our receiving the gift of salvation, as Paul alluded to a moment ago. I'm not going to tackle that one. But I will come back later to the role of God's grace in our having what we might call the fullness of freedom. The important thing for now is that we see that in God's eyes, there are significant choices that we make for which we bear moral responsibility. Paul invited me to speak to you today about the topic of human free will and its relationship to science, because some scientists and commentators on science are claiming that our belief that we are in control of our ordinary choices is simply an illusion, systematically an illusion. They say that as scientists have begun to look under the hood and investigate how our minds operate, the picture that emerges is that it is all driven by unconscious processes. No one is in charge, paradoxical as that sounds. I will talk about some of the science that lies behind this rather shocking claim, enough to show you that the claim is not well supported. It is an overreaction to some surprising things that we are learning about the limits of our self-understanding and about our own fragility, the fragility of our own minds. I'll then return to the scriptures in order to show that the scientific findings that I discuss mesh, I think, rather well with a basic New Testament teaching concerning our present condition, one that calls us to patience and endurance while also offering us hope. Okay, first finding. There's a guy on an operating table. When you decide to move your body, raise your arm, say, a signal is sent from your brain to your muscles. Move now. And when all goes well, your arm moves. In the early days of neurosurgery, in the 1950s and 1960s, surgeons discovered, when they were doing operations on people's brains, that they could directly induce that muscle signal to bypassing the person's conscious will. Right? They could just directly cause your arm to just go up by touching the right part of your brain. That shouldn't be surprising that they're able to do that, because somehow the message has got to go from your brain to your body, and so if you just go further down the process, you should be able to just trigger that impulse directly that way. But what was surprising was how the patients responded to what happened when they saw their arm go up. You see, when patients were being operated on for brain surgery, they were often kept awake, right? You don't have pain nerves on the brain itself. It's safely tucked inside your skull. So they would give patients a local anesthetic, right, on the skull, cut open the skull, and then start doing brain surgery, and the person's awake, right? And so then when the surgeons would, and they didn't know a lot about the brain. They still don't know a lot about the brain, and I'll come back to that. But they really didn't know a lot about the brain back in the 1950s. And so sometimes they very gently kind of probe different parts of the brain and try to gauge from the response of the person to get a better handle on, oh, okay, this part of the brain is relevant to this kind of function, right? I mean, how else are you going to learn about it? So when they would probe the part of the brain that would trigger the muscle movement, the arm going up, one of the surgeons had the idea to ask the patient, why did you just do that? Okay? And the patients would invariably respond, oh, I was trying to get your attention, or something like that. But what was strange about this is that that's not true, right? We know they weren't trying to do anything. It was just directly stimulating the motor movement part of the brain. There was no deciding or trying or anything like that. And yet, when a person saw their arm go up, they immediately, sincerely believed, oh, I did that. Now, when you think about it, why would they come to believe that? Well, because usually when I see my arm go up and someone else isn't lifting my arm, it's because I decided to move it, right? And so when they weren't expecting seeing their arm go up, it's as if they unconsciously reinterpreted what just happened. They just assumed, oh, I was trying to get your attention, okay? Now, so some people took this to be some kind of evidence that when we think we're consciously willing something, we're not really responsible for what's going on. But if you think about it, this isn't evidence that our conscious decisions to do things are not effective. After all, it's not a case where someone is deciding anything at all. Rather, it shows us that our decisions to do things and the beliefs we have about what we just decided to do involve distinct pathways in our brains. In weird situations like this experiment, this kind of surgery setup, they can come apart so that we could come to sincerely believe we just decided to do something when we hadn't. If you naively thought that your mind was simple, entirely simple and transparent to you how it works, this simple experiment tells you to think again. We are complex systems, and to work right, several things have to work in tandem as designed. But again, it's not any kind of evidence that when we are consciously deciding to do something, that we're not in charge of that. All right. A second type of study is low tech. It comes from social psychology. So some social scientists set up a situation where they would have an actor pose with their car on the side of a road with the hood up. Back in the day, for those of you who are younger than 30, if your car stalled, you didn't have a cell phone. So what do? If you're in some neighborhood not where you live, you pop your hood up, and then you just wait for some generous person to come by and pull over and say, hey, can I take you somewhere to a phone? They take you to these funny boxes called phone booths. There's usually one of those every few blocks in the city, so you could call somebody and get help. That's what you had to do. Okay, so here's what they did. They would have a jackhammer, kind of a really loud noise, going in the background, right, while they did this. And then they wanted to test how many people stop. It's a kind of a well-trafficked neighborhood while this jackhammer was going on, as opposed to a situation where there was no loud noise going on in the background. And they found that a much higher rate of people would stop to help when the jackhammer wasn't doing its thing than when it was, okay? So that's one study. Paul's going to like this next one. It involves seminary students. So they took some seminary students. When you go to seminary, Paul can tell you about this, you'll take a class on preaching, and your final test is to give a sermon before your classmates. So they had the text that was given to these seminarians was the parable of the Good Samaritan, right? I'm going to trust that most of you know the parable of the Good Samaritan. And so these people are preparing their test, and then they arrange to cause the people to be late getting there in time for their final test sermon. So they're all stressed out, right? They put kind of funny obstacles in their path and just made things very difficult for them to get to class on time, right? And then what they did, very cleverly, was to put somebody lying on the road, right, or path that on their way to class, bleeding, in obvious physical pain, just like the Good Samaritan. And they said, how many of these future pastors stop to help this person when they're all stressed out about getting there? Turns out a much lower percentage than when you didn't have that, when they weren't rushed, right? Okay. So what should we conclude from this these kinds of studies? Right? There's one important bit I forgot to tell you, which is afterwards, after the experiment, they would ask the people, we saw that you didn't stop to help the person who had their hood up, or to the seminarian, we saw you didn't stop. Did you notice there was this person on the side of the road? You didn't stop to help them when you're on your way. Why? And they asked, and none of them would cite, well, it was because there was this loud noise going in the background, right? But we know clearly, or it seems, that this was influencing their behavior because the rate of help would drop when you would introduce this environmental variable, as scientists would say. All right, so what should we say about these studies? All right, because some people say, see, look, this shows we don't really know what's influencing us. Right? There can be things going on around us, and we're just not aware of it, and they cause us to do moral behavior or not, right? Even though it's not relevant to what we should be doing. Well, the first thing you should know is that the science here is actually a lot shakier. In fact, social psychology is going through a bit of a crisis right now. We are constantly reading about famous studies like this. My favorite one is the study that people suggested that you go into a room and you're asked, right, you agree to participate in a psychology experiment, but you don't know the real purpose of the experiment. You're watching a film of some elderly people having a conversation, okay? And then you walk out of the room, and then they videotape people secretly in the hallway as they left the room. And then the claim was, if you watched elderly people talking, you walked more slowly as you left the room after you just saw them talking than if you watched, say, a couple of animated young people having a conversation. But when others try to repeat these studies, it turns out the results often don't get replicated. They either get no difference between the so-called experimental and control groups, or they get far more modest differences. So the science here is actually a lot shakier. And it's important to know that because you probably read, you get pop up in your news feed, links to studies of this sort all the time. But let's suppose there is something real being measured here. Perhaps each of us has a modest tendency to act differently because of certain features of our surroundings when we're not even aware that those features are influencing our thinking about what we should do. Even if this is right, it also doesn't show that we are not in conscious control of the decisions that we make. It shows only that we are not fully aware of what influences our thinking when we are deciding. That's a real limit, of course. We'd all like to be fully on top of our own motivations, always understand just what it is that is inclining us to do the things we do. But it's not exactly news that we're not always aware of such things. It's similar to something that I think we're all familiar with. Sometimes we're hard-pressed to say why exactly we have a strong emotional reaction to some remark or behavior of someone that maybe doesn't set off other people. Anyone who has been in marital counseling can attest to that. In any case, the take-home message here seems to be we have limited self-awareness, and that means a limit to our control, not a total lack of control. All right, a third bit of evidence involves an uncommon and strange disorder of the will. Older folks here may recognize the comedic actor Peter Sellers from the old Stanley Kubrick film Dr. Strangelove. The character in that film suffers from what is known as alien hand syndrome. His hand performs certain actions, such as taking someone else's glass of water and drinking it. But the person sincerely doesn't think that it's his action, that it's something that he's in control of. He's not aware of consciously intending to do it, and he might even be embarrassed by it. This is a real syndrome that people have. But it's not like a random muscle spasm, right? It's a deliberate behavior, so it's obviously issuing from inside the person somehow, from some kind of unconscious goal that the person has. But he's not aware of it, and the person is confused by it. It's very strange. Somewhat similar are the behaviors of people who suffer from severe schizophrenia, when they have a powerful sense of being controlled by an alien mind. Now, some want to draw from this rare and somewhat unsettling kind of phenomena a lesson concerning everyone's behavior all the time. They suggest that this kind of this kind of weird disorder is a clue that indicates that there are always unconscious mechanisms that lead us to do what we do. When all goes well, we have the conscious sense that we are in charge, right? But in reality, even when all is going well, this is just window dressing that accompanies the real action, which lies deep in the recesses of our unconscious mind. But here again, this kind of conclusion, this really radical general conclusion, people are never in conscious control of what they do, goes well beyond the evidence. One thing that alien hand syndrome shows is that it is possible for our actions to be generated entirely unconsciously, not by anything we're deciding to do. But think about it. We already knew that. Much of the day, we go about our routine business more or less on autopilot. Unlike God, we humans can consciously focus on only so much of what we're doing. Very little, in fact. So it's more efficient for us to automate the routine stuff. We'd be exhausted by noon if we had to consciously decide each and every little movement that we make. First left foot, then right foot, right? It doesn't happen. You just say go, walk, go over there, and then you're not really consciously deciding anything. It's just it works. So we kind of operate like CEOs, right? Whose job it is to make big scale decisions, right? And then to trust his associate staff to carry out the details and work through, right? Not to try to decide each and every behavior of the corporation. And if you think about it, for some things, like walking down a flight of steps, if we did try to consciously control the movement of your feet, it would likely be a disaster. Don't do it. Just walk. If you actually tried to tell yourself what to do, you'd probably trip, right? So a lot of our behavior is automated. It's just somehow, we don't know how it works, right? It is going on below our conscious awareness. But that doesn't give us reason to think that when we are consciously attending to things and deliberately deciding to do this rather than that the choice is not, in those cases, really consciously controlled. Now, the fact is, neuroscientists know very little at present about exactly how conscious or unconscious behavior comes about, right? How the incredibly complex machinery of our brains carries out any kind of behavior. But the little evidence that there is indicates that these processes are, in fact, quite distinct when it comes to consciously deciding and just automatically doing things. The only way, really, that alien hand syndrome and schizophrenic psychosis differ from this familiar fact of life largely lived on autopilot is that what the person with the syndrome unconsciously does is at odds with what she consciously wants to be doing. That added wrinkle also doesn't show us that when we do seem to be consciously deciding to do something, it's an illusion. Instead, it does show us something important, but it's not that. What it does show us is that we are psychologically very fragile. It's possible for any of us, for our unconscious and conscious desires and other mental states, beliefs and intentions and goals to get misaligned. And we are not in control of whether or not that happens, that misalignment happens. Syndromes happen to people. They're not in control of whether it happens to them. No more than we're in control of whether or not our bodies function as they should. Okay, back to neuroscience. So this next study has done more than anything else to lead a lot of people to claim that conscious control of choice is an illusion. It's been almost 40 years now since the original study was published by a guy named Benjamin Libet. And a lot of variations on his original study have been done since. I will be involved with the pictured international team of neuroscientists and philosophers on a 4-year study of human free will that kicks off this May. Libet-inspired studies that I'm about to describe to you will still be on the agenda, So people find the very simple kind of study that he did very compelling, and some people find it very disturbing. All right, so how does this go? All right, you see that little clock dial on the left? Sorry, I didn't get the animated GIF to work right to have it spinning around. But Libet, the neuroscientist, came up with a way to compare people's sense of when they consciously decide to do something with electrical activity going on in the brain at the same time. So he's monitoring what's going on in your brain, kind of the electrical activity in your brain. You see the little person there in the cartoon. They've got this kind of funny skull cap on, a bunch of electrodes. It's basically just monitoring all the electrical activity that's going on in the person's head. And they're given a simple task to do, okay? So in the setup, if you agree to do this, right, you're told, here's what we want you to do. Once I say go, I want you to consciously decide to, say, flick your wrist, okay? But I want you to do it spontaneously. Don't pre-plan it, okay? So just do it. It's of your own free will. You choose when to do it, okay? So for some people it might be in 5 seconds. Other people might wait 45 seconds. It's up to you. Don't pre-plan. We want you to do it spontaneously, okay? Here is what Libet appeared to discover something very surprising. Because when he's monitoring the electrical activity in the person's brain, about a half second or so before the person reports, that's when I decided to do it, he noticed a ramping up of electrical activity in the brain, right? So the way the person reports, they're looking at that clock and the dial's spinning around very rapidly, okay? And so you're supposed to say exactly where was that little bead of light on that clock at the time you decided, when you felt the conscious urge or decision to flick your wrist, right? Note that. And then they would compare it with readout of electrical activity in the person's brain. And so here's a little diagram. That little ramping up line and then going down, that's a kind of a measure of how much electrical activity is going on the scalp. And you can see it's kind of ramping up, all right? And it starts, you see 3 lines going down. That's the first one just indicates when it starts. The second one is the time, because time is going across the horizontal axis. The second line is when the person becomes aware of the decision to move. And then the third line is when they actually move their wrist, just a split second later. But you can see the electrical activity got going about a half second before the person thought, now I've decided to do it. So Libet's conclusion from this was, your brain decides before you do, right? When you consciously, you have this sense of consciously deciding to do something, you're just catching up with what your brain has unconsciously already decided to do. There is no free will. All right, what should we make of this study? We should first keep clear a basic distinction. It's one thing for something to causally influence a conscious choice that you make. It's another for that thing to causally determine it, to make it certain to occur, to guarantee that it occurs. Because there are, obviously, all sorts of causal influences on everything that we do. And contrary to what Libet claimed, his study does not indicate that an unconscious part of your brain decided before you did. Since the electrical activity that he was picking up on, that he detected, does not, further study has shown, determine the choice that you will make. So it's not an infallible guarantee that you are going to, in fact, move your wrist, right? It just makes it more likely than chance. That's all it turns out. So they would notice this ramping up activity would often occur even when the person didn't go ahead and make the choice. More recent studies have raised bigger problems for Libet's conclusion. One recent study shows that people in these experiments are actually dimly aware at a slightly earlier point of their being about to flick their wrist. And there's also reason to think that the portion of that electrical activity that's being monitored by that big chart is that the portion of it that's possibly relevant to deciding actually comes later. It's not the early part that's actually relevant to deciding. It's not a physical precursor of deciding. Putting these two things together, it turns out that the physical start of the action occurs pretty much at the same time as the person takes themselves to be consciously deciding what to do. It's fair to say there is now a consensus among knowledgeable neuroscientists and the occasional philosopher who pays attention to these things that Libet's studies simply don't support their advertised conclusion. Nonetheless, I told you about Libet's study because there are scholars outside these areas who continue to say loudly that Libet showed that free will is an illusion. And this has begun to seep out to the public through the popular writings of people like Sam Harris. Sam Harris cites this all the time. He says, this shows we have no free will. There is a general lesson here. Science, I believe, is a very good thing. As with all human activities, it's limited in scope and fallible. And it's occasionally affected by the biases of scientists. But it also has strong self-correcting mechanisms to weed those out over time. But it just takes time before we can be confident of the apparent findings of science. Public reporting on science is a whole nother thing. And we should be really skeptical. The way that science gets reported is often not in step with what the scientists themselves claim. They make much more limited, cautious claims about their studies. And we should be especially wary of people who stand to make a buck, reporting sensational science news in mass market paperbacks. All right, I'm going to wrap up my survey of the relevant science by addressing a more general sort of argument against free will, human free will and moral responsibility. Indeed, it's part of an argument against human meaning and purpose. It's a hammer to strike an all-purpose blow for a bleak vision of reality, a very nihilistic vision of reality. There's evidence that this way of thinking influences some people's behavior for the worse, and this way of thinking I'm about to describe is increasing in our scientific age. So it's important for us to address it head on. The argument goes like this. Look, a human being is a meat-based machine. Everything we do has to be determined in one way or another by the activity and arrangements of our parts because we are nothing more than the sum of our parts. And the forces that govern how our most basic parts interact are not responsive to meaning or purpose. They are mindless electrical or chemical interactions. Or, as one prominent neuroscientist said at a conference that I attended just 2 weeks ago, we are just a pack of neurons, which are just a bunch of electrical circuits. He said, that's what a human being is. That kind of statement is a faith statement of a guy who studies the behavior of individual neurons, the cells that make up your brain. And there are 100 billion of them, 100 billion neurons that make up your brain. So he studies the behavior of how do little individual neurons communicate with each other, right? And to a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? The thing to understand is that different sciences come at the study of the world from different angles, and no individual science provides a complete picture of how the natural world works. Alongside the sciences that break things down and study individual parts, there are other sciences whose job it is to see how lots of things get organized into self-regulating structures. These structures harness, right, so that you've got there kind of arrows going up, genes, proteins, pathways, subcellular mechanisms, cells, tissues, organs, organism, right, biology, all the different levels of our body, right? But then you also have these big arrows, the ways in which bodies and larger parts of our bodies regulate smaller scale parts. It goes both ways, is the point. Causal influence goes both ways within our bodies. These kinds of organized structures harness new principles that cannot be captured simply in terms of how individual parts work. In other words, the whole is more than the sum of its parts when it comes to these kinds of systems. There are many structures like this in the physical world, but the most striking, of course, are indeed living bodies. And in particular, the thinking, creating, and meaning-responsive human bodies. The sciences that deal with complex systems reveal something very different from the reductionistic, we're just a bunch of electrical circuits kind of perspective. In complex systems, there's an interplay of bottom-up and top-down influences, interwoven into a seamless whole. Dennis Noble is a distinguished systems biologist at Oxford University. His book on the left, The Music of Life, describes numerous ways that living bodies control the behavior of their very parts. Take the gene. Richard Dawkins, you probably have heard of, famous atheist, biologist, and an arch-reductionist, Dawkins likes to quip that a body is just a gene's way of reproducing itself. Okay? Noble says, on the contrary, when you look at the functioning of the whole organism and how it interacts with the genes embedded within it, the whole organism determines how the gene expresses itself, what it does. Because scientists are actually able to do this, they've learned that if you put the same gene in a different organism, it will express itself in a completely different way. The context, the global context, the whole organism actually determines, there's an interplay. The genes contain information, and they do things that influence the body, but the body also tells the gene what it needs from that gene. It partly determines how the gene expresses itself. Right? There's both bottom up and top down. It's going on simultaneously. The second book, the book in the middle there, is by George Ellis, a quite brilliant cosmologist and Christian. In his book, a recent book called How Can Physics Underlie the Mind, he gives an overview of the many ways that top-down factors complement bottom-up factors throughout nature, starting from physics itself. The last book there that I put on the screen there is a collection of articles that I co-edited with George on how this plays out specifically when it comes to the neurobiology of human free will. Now, how exactly we should understand the human mind is still an open question. It's still debated. There is a lot of science yet to be done. But we already know from the get-go that our experiences, feelings, thoughts, attitudes, goals affect our bodies in all kinds of ways. And there is no reason, on current evidence, to think anything different when it comes to our making conscious choices. I suggested earlier that we think of free will this way. In situations of practical uncertainty, when we're uncertain about what to do, and when we're confronted with options and feel some pull towards each of them, it's in our power to choose any of them. That's how it appears from the inside, you might say. Right? That's kind of how we experience making choices. Here's a complementary, more science-y way of saying pretty much the same thing. Free will is a form of conscious, top-down control over one's own behavior that is causally influenced, but not causally determined by psychological factors and other factors of which we are more or less aware. Notice that this way of putting it indicates that free will can come in degrees, which is plausible. It's not an all or nothing thing. We are not gods, right? We are human beings. We have a limited measure of control over our own behavior. In fact, that point was emphasized in a sermon of Paul's, there we are, a few weeks ago on Psalm 8. Perhaps you remember it. That passage, the biblical passage that I had us read a little bit ago, that talks about you were created a little lower than the heavenly beings, and God crowned us with glory and honor. And Paul's sermon a few weeks ago emphasized that we are strange hybrid creatures. We're situated between animals on the one hand, right, non-human animals, and the heavenly beings. We've got this kind of dual split nature. We're like angels in certain respects and being conscious, self-aware beings who have some degree of control over our behavior. But we're also like animals in other respects. We're kind of in the middle. And this biblical passage, I think, fits well with the emerging theme from the study of human behavior, which is that our control is impressive, but it's limited. In being tied to the biological world as we all are, unlike angels, our freedom is a somewhat messy matter. When it comes to thinking and acting as we were meant to, we are incredibly fragile, and things often get out of whack. Some of us human beings are sufficiently damaged as to lack moral freedom altogether. Human beings who simply lack control over their moral choice making. This is rare, but it happens. There are some people who are sufficiently damaged that they're not capable of moral freedom, whether for a time or maybe even throughout their entire natural lives. Even so, for most of us, the ability to choose is real and it's important. It enables us to fulfill, or at least to try to fulfill, our God-given mandate to act as stewards over God's creation. Okay, an objection. Maybe, the objector might say, maybe the case against free will is not in yet. But why think we have it? Why think we actually have free will? Do we have evidence that directly confirms, corroborates, that shows that we have free will? We sometimes forget that scientists are people too. And that's worth pointing out, not just because for some people the scientist is their husband or wife. The point, rather, is that science is an organized activity. Scientific results don't just come down from the heavens, delivered to us. They are the product of scientists who are human beings, just like the rest of us, and a highly coordinated activity that scientists engage in. Whenever we act, any of us, we necessarily assume that we know what we are doing and why we are doing it. That's just an assumption of acting. You have to make choices, you have to assume you know what it is you're doing or you're trying to do. To rationally accept a scientific theory, which is an output of scientific activity, we have to assume that the experimenters were knowingly guided by purposes that they successfully carried out, by intending actions that advance those purposes. And this connects to a larger point. We cannot provide evidence for everything. It's impossible for finite, limited beings. We have to start somewhere. You can't argue for everything. So there must be assumptions, call them starting points, that we are rationally entitled to make. Beliefs that are, you might say, innocent until proven guilty. Okay? Well, obviously, you cannot reasonably assume just anything. So which beliefs have this special status of being, reasonable starting points? Things that are innocent until proven guilty, right? Well, if this were a philosophy seminar, we'd have a long argument about that. Here, I'll just suggest that reasonable starting points have at least these three characteristics that I have up on the screen. These are the kinds of things that we just find instinctive as human beings, that are embedded in our regular experience, and that seem to be absolutely foundational, necessary to our being able to understand important aspects of the world. Given those criteria, we'll want to include the assumption that our basic cognitive tools are reliable, right? Our memory, our senses. If we didn't assume that those tools were reliable, we would not be able to get anything done, right? End of story. So it seems like we are entitled to assume that our basic cognitive tools are reliable. In addition, philosophers have shown that there are certain highly general beliefs about the world that you cannot sensibly argue for. Again, these seem to be assumptions that we have to bring to our investigation of the world around us. Okay? I could spend time talking about these kinds of assumptions, but think about it. I'll just talk briefly about the last one, right? We're all aware of what it's like on the inside for ourselves, our own conscious self. What about other people, even people that you are extremely close to? Well, what you know about what's going on for them is just what you observe in their faces, their bodies, their movements, right? So you don't directly encounter the conscious experiences and thoughts of any other person other than yourself. Well, how do you know then that other people are not just cleverly disguised automatons, right? Machines that function in very purposive kinds of ways, robots, right? You've never gotten inside any other person and saw reality from the way they see it, right? You can't directly verify it. So you can't really give evidence. And you could say, if you say, well, they're a lot like me, so probably they are conscious minds too. But is it good science to generalize from a single case to billions of other people and say they must be like, because I had one result, right? Okay, my body is moved by a conscious mind, so I guess their bodies are moved by conscious minds too. So that doesn't seem like a very impressive argument, right? Scientists are not impressed by single data points as evidence for anything. But, of course, it's reasonable, isn't it, to think that there are other people are conscious, animated beings just like ourselves? It seems like something we just have to assume, right? Nobody thinks it's unreasonable to think otherwise. So there are lots of very general beliefs about that. That's the point. And another such thing is perhaps the idea that we are free to choose. That belief, the belief that we are free and morally responsible beings, is basic to the way that we interpret our social world. It's hardly imaginable, if you think about it, that we could abandon that belief. All right? Okay, then you say, well, what about all those books and articles where people say they disbelieve in free will and moral responsibility? Or the claim of the neuroscientists that I noted a little while back, that we're just a bunch of electrical circuits, right? What about those kinds of claims? Well, I take these people at their word, that they believe that they disbelieve in our own freedom and moral responsibility. That's purely theoretical. They have a theory about their own belief. They say, I don't really believe it, right? But I think their theory about themselves is mistaken. When it comes to what they and everybody else straight out believe about the moral status of other people, we should consider not just what they say, but what they do. Think of Jesus when he said, if you believe in me, you will obey me. Jesus linked real belief with behavior of a certain kind. And what we find is that, like the rest of us, they are morally indignant when, say, someone cheats them of something, right? Even if they profess, I don't believe that human beings are free and morally responsible, steal something valuable from them and see how they behave. Or like Calvin, right? When Hobbes trips Calvin, right? His just instinctive reaction is, you did that. You're responsible. You just did a bad thing, right? And he was not just unhappy, he was morally indignant. He had a moral reaction to what happened. This is something we're all hardwired to do, the way we respond to one another, right? We interpret behavior in moral terms. All right, let us now return to the scriptures. I noted that the picture slowly emerging from the sciences indicates that our control over our own decisions is limited and fragile, subject to both physical and psychological disorders. This actually fits well, I think, with a rather strong note of pessimism in the Bible when it comes to human freedom. It's a pessimism that does not contradict, but complements the choice-affirming passages that we saw earlier. So consider that the Apostle Paul describes us in the book of Romans as having been enslaved to sin until Christ sets us free. Echoing Paul, the great 5th century church father, Augustine, recounted his struggle to truly convert to Christianity when he was a talented and worldly 20-something on the make in the Roman Empire. Right? Augustine, he converts to Christianity at about the age of 30, but he wrestled with Christianity for a long period of time in his 20s. And he famously tells us of a particular prayer of his at that time. The prayer was this. This is just before he converts to Christianity. He said, "Lord, give me chastity, but not yet." Okay? So, as Augustine recognized, he couldn't have it both ways. That's why he knew he had yet to convert, right? It was part of his struggle. He couldn't have it both ways. He knew that real conversion requires wholehearted commitment. And his problem was that he wasn't able to conjure up such a commitment even though he wanted it. He got to a point before he converted where he said, I want to be in on this thing. I actually want to follow Jesus Christ. Doing that requires wholehearted commitment, and I just can't bring myself. I can bring myself to pray to God, but I cannot bring myself to wholeheartedly follow the way of Jesus. He recognized this, and he saw it as this impossible quandary. He talks about this in his famous book, The Confessions. Eventually, he tells us, it came to him in a moment of divine grace. God needed to give him the ability to will obedience to God wholeheartedly. And this led Augustine to the insight that we can think of human freedom of choice in two ways. We all have the freedom to make choices, the freedom that grounds our moral responsibility for our actions. But there is another, deeper freedom, what Augustine calls true freedom, which is the freedom to follow through on our choices, to be steadfast of heart, to consistently live along a path that one recognizes to be life-giving. And that brings us to the words of Jesus in the Gospel of John. Jesus said, "So if the Son sets you free, you will be free indeed." We, followers of Christ, are free, aren't we? And yet, doesn't it also seem often at times that we are not free? That sin so easily entangles us still? Somehow both of these things are true. Theologians describe this tension as our being caught between the already and the not yet. At present, it seems, we only have a taste, or what Paul elsewhere describes as a deposit, on the fullness that still awaits us. For now, we have to resolve in the way that Paul did in the epistle to the Philippians, when he wrote, not that I have already obtained all this, or have already arrived at my goal, but I press on to take hold of that for which Christ Jesus took hold of me. This is difficult, and it requires us to seek and receive God's renewing power day by day. But we do so with the sure promise that was sounded in that same letter. Being confident of this, Paul writes, that he who began a good work in you will carry it on to completion until the day of Christ Jesus. Please join me in prayer. O God and Father of our Lord and precious Savior, Jesus Christ, giver of every good and perfect gift, we thank you that we are wonderfully and fearfully made. You have given us capacities to know and choose, to conceive and create, to enjoy and love. We are, every one of us here, blessed to be dependent and imperfect images, icons of your uncreated and perfect glory. But we are also cracked icons, subject to disorder without and within, we struggle to use your gifts well. In your mercy, continue to repair the flaws that run through our hearts and minds. Help us to fix our thoughts more steadily on the way of Jesus. And as we do, may your Spirit strengthen and deepen our desire to follow that way. Strengthen this congregation that they may be gladly instruments of your life-giving grace to one another until the day when the not yet gives way to the fullness of your coming kingdom. We ask these things through our Lord Jesus Christ, who lives in fullness of joy with you and the Holy Spirit, now and forever. Amen.